Okay, we are live. We are good to go. How is everyone doing today? Hope all is well. Let's get started with this live stream. We have, of course, Alexander Mercouris in London, the Oracle of London, with us. And we have a man who needs no introduction, the great Robert Barnes. Robert, where can people find you?
Yeah, for all the content, including exclusive content, Hush Hush content series about alternative theories and narratives, about a wide range of events from January 6th to the Ukrainian conflict, as well as people get to post. It's the, is it vivabarneslaw.locals.com? That's where you can find it. Second best locals community to the Duran.locals.com.
The best locals community, the best locals community. And Robert, before we get started, I have to ask you one thing before we get moving. First of all, hello to everybody that's watching us, Rumble, Odyssey, Rockfin now, and Locals Chat, and YouTube. Hello to our awesome moderators as well. I see Valies in the house, and Zariel is with us, and I think I saw Reckless Abandon and Alan Watson, and who else is with us moderating? I hope I didn't miss anybody. I think I got everybody that is moderating. Robert, I saw your live stream with Viva the other day, and you were wearing some Tennessee merch, some Tennessee colors. I have to ask you, how good was Peyton Manning?
Oh, in my view, Peyton was the greatest ever. He got robbed from the Heisman. I call it the Heistman. He and Randy Moss for that very overrated defensive back, Charles Woodson, who gave up over 200 yards to a mediocre receiver, never made it in the NFL, and yet, based on that performance, somehow got the Heisman. The power of media bias, the power of media narrative, the power of who votes, because you look at who, it's always about who decides anything, power, politics, you name it, including the Heisman. Most voters came from the Northeast and the Midwest. Most of your great football performers came from the Southeast. But the Southeast was underrepresented in the Heisman voting cast, and that hurt Peyton Manning. And it was also, poor data analysis that year. He faced 8 of the top 30 pass defenses in the country. Charles Woodson only faced one decent pass offense all year. We could go on and on. So but the win was fantastic. It was old school American football. It's a little bit like European football in the sense that American college football, at least at Tennessee, they sing songs. A lot of places they don't have great songs. They have some decent chants and whatnot. But Tennessee football is the most resembles like your great songs of Man United and all those. Well, basically every European team pretty much has some sort of great chants, great songs. We have Rocky Top, which is about drinking corn from a jar, which is basically talking about moonshine. They end up not only taking down the field goal post, they removed him from the entire stadium and stuck him in the river as celebration, and then they crowdfunded replacing them within 24 hours. So one of the greatest wins in the history of Tennessee football. But it's a great tradition, community. You get a sense, they're singing together, chanting together, and just joyous kind of celebration. The best of sport, in my opinion.
Wow, absolutely. And Tennessee, one of the best football programs out there, that's for sure. No doubt about that. Let's get started then with this live stream. Timing is everything. Timing is everything, gentlemen. And we have a lot of news stories to get to where I think the timing of everything is going on is critical. So, Alexander, I pass it off to you and to Robert. Let's get moving.
Timing is absolutely critical. And the most critical event of all is the one that's looming on the horizon in the United States on the 8th of November, if I'm correct. And that is the midterms. Now, it's difficult perhaps even for Americans to understand the extent to which the world now is shaping itself around this. But I've been reading reports, for example, that in Ukraine, the Ukrainian military is trying to achieve a breakthrough in Kherson region so that they can score a victory before the midterms. The midterms in the United States are dictating the course of the battle there. They're dictating strategic, tactical decisions by the Ukrainian army and Russian responses to it. So the midterms are vastly important. They're going to make the weather. Everybody is nervous about them in Europe. in Britain, perhaps especially. We have a massive political crisis here in Britain, which we've discussed extensively on the Duran. And of course, if you think that is unrelated to what is coming in the United States, then I'm afraid you don't understand British politics at all. So, Robert, what is coming? What is going to happen in the midterms?
Yeah, right before I launch into that, I wanted to thank both of you guys for providing continuous, top-notch commentary. We really haven't had anything like this. We've had versions of it, newsletters, publications, Counterpunch back in the day, et cetera. But those were more sporadic, more occasional, not comprehensive, not daily, of what both of you guys put up on your own channels. And remind people that the court of public opinion matters, that I like to say the greatest trick the devil ever pulled is convincing people he did not exist. I stole that from a movie, 9 Mile. Another great one is that they don't spend all this time lying to us if our opinions don't matter. And I know as a matter of fact, people who observe your programs, who are in positions of institutional influence here in the United States, that has made a difference at both media institutions and people running for office, including United States Senate. Who've stuck with their position despite a lot of political and financial pressure to avoid it or to go back on it. So that's where I was spending this morning at the Duranshop.com, drnshop.com, because it's good to continue to support important voices like this that do break through. And when people get sort of disconcerted or distressed at feeling, hey, maybe my opinion doesn't matter. Maybe nobody's opinion matters. Maybe the system just marches on with its inveterate corruption. Remember that is deep. That is what the system wants you to believe, so that you don't make a difference, so you don't try to make a difference, because in the end, a person in front of a tank can make a difference. Support Duran, support yourself. And just wanted to say that at the top. I was dealing with a corrupt arbitration proceeding I can't even talk about in detail because it's all secret here in America. This complete hijacking the American legal system. I was getting annoyed over the weekend and I had to remind myself of these principles and these precepts that we're seeing a difference. Now to the midterms, definitely they make a big difference. As you note, that there's increasing evidence that Ukraine is designing their military strategy this month around U.S. midterm interest in the Biden administration. There was a leak back a ways when they did the counteroffensive in Kharkiv that the CIA didn't want them to do that they wanted them focused on Kherson. The reason was purely political. And it was gaining some empty space in a few small unoccupied towns in the Kharkiv region. Wasn't going to have the political ramifications that seizing a major city in the Kherson region on the border of Crimea was going to do. It's probably apparent now that both the Nord Stream attack and the Crimean bridge attack were U.S. intelligence backed at some level. And that I think you're right. They wanted them to go in and split Kherson and cut off the land bridge and also take back Kherson as well. And all of that went south because Ukraine knew they really couldn't win there. So they went where they could win, where there weren't a lot of troops, where Russia was happy to retreat and just bomb the heck out of them and with artillery and the rest. Where, it's a lot of confession through projection going on, continuing to accuse Russia of seeking weapons from foreign countries when it's Ukraine that's begging for weapons from foreign countries and is out of weapons, pretending Russia's out of weapons. That's why I tell people, just use that confession through projection principle and you can know what they think, what Ukraine is currently facing. They accuse Russia of lack of weapons, it probably means Ukraine lacks them. If they accuse Russia of desperately seeking weapons from foreign countries, it means Ukraine is desperately short and seeking weapons from foreign nations, so on and so forth. But you're absolutely right. It's clear that the Biden administration is obsessed with some sort of PR victory on Ukraine because the conflict hasn't gone as expected. Despite, if you follow U.S. intelligence here, at least their supporters, if you will, in the think tanks and the blogosphere and the rest, every day they're spinning that Russia's losing and Ukraine is winning. It's astounding. No matter what happens, Russia's losing, Ukraine's winning. Russia's just about to fall apart, etc. But if you follow people like Colonel McGregor, he's been critical of this all the way through, has said Russia's not going to lose, Ukraine is going to win. I mean, Ukraine's always going to lose, Russia's always going to win. The only question is the scale of the victory. The only question is the scale of the Ukrainian defeat. And he identifies Zelensky as a lunatic who's talking about nuclear bombs every 5 seconds. So the interspersion of Biden talking about it. But I think you definitely, and you can have an argument that the leak of Hunter Biden getting indicted was in response to Joe Biden temporarily talking like Elon Musk about settlement of you, in the sense of, hey, we're near nuclear Armageddon. Maybe that's what he meant. And maybe that's why, look at the timing, they suddenly leak, well, maybe we'll indict your son and go after your whole family. Then Biden walks that back, and it's back to uber aggressivity towards Ukraine. Republicans have held so far the percentage of the number of Republicans who have opposed Ukrainian involvement in Ukrainian money has held at that 57, 58 or so House number and decent number in the Senate. Nowhere near a majority, nowhere near what it should be. But if people look at it in context, there were only one or two who objected at the time in the House of the Gulf of Tonkin. And so this is usually it takes several years for anti-war sentiment to build up in America amongst elected officials. The deep state's that powerful. Here they've held despite lots of attacks. Same with certain Senate candidates like Blake Masters, J.D. Vance. And we've seen Trump escalate this. It's now part of his stump speech. There should be peace in Ukraine. There should be peace deal. They should cut a deal. They should cut a deal. They should cut a deal. He's being more aggressive and assertive on that on a regular basis. So Biden needs a PR victory. He needs a kind of an October surprise. All the historical numbers say they'll get wiped out in the House, that they'll lose the Senate, that they'll lose governorships, that they'll lose state legislatures, that they will be in a tough predicament for the 2 years following. And so they need to reverse that. And the October surprise so far has been trying to provoke some foreign disaster somewhere, some foreign conflict that he can claim victory in. And so, and apparently this is Putin reportedly referenced this himself, saying that Brittany Griner wasn't in any rush to release Brittany Griner to help Joe Biden in the midterms. There's now talk that Russia may time its invasion in a way that has negative impact on Biden in the midterms. We'll see. It wouldn't be outside of, I think Putin, reasonably blames Biden for a lot of this escalation of what took place, particularly the failure of a peace deal in March in Turkey. That was, Bojo was the leader of it, of blowing that up. But I think the Biden administration deserves a lot of blame as well. So, yeah, I think there's no question that they're scheduling Ukraine around elections, which is quite disturbing, of course. Not the first time. Iran, Contra, you go back to aspects of that, the 1980 election, whether or not certain things took place by the CIA to try to pay back Carter for trying to purge certain aspects of the CIA from its most corrupt elements and help Reagan get in. And it was a little odd that Reagan gets inaugurated and suddenly the Iranians feel compelled to release hostages. It's just like, well, why would that happen exactly? But so it's not new, sadly. But I think there's definitely correlation. And then, of course, the election definitely has consequence. The more populists that win, the more the deep state will be challenged in its funding priorities. If Republicans do seize the House and the Senate, that will have an impact on a range of policies. And then if particular people get in, very, like one of the most critical people on the war has been J.D. Vance. If you get, right now, only really Paul in the Senate has been consistently critical of the Ukrainian conflict. Frankly, J.D. Vance has been even more critical of it. Staked his primary campaign on it with great risk. I talked to him for a substantial time period before we made that decision. If people like him get into the United States Senate, if people like Blake Masters get into the United States Senate, to some degree, Eric Greitens has been back and not Eric Greitens, but Eric Schmidt has been back and forth on it. But those two in particular, you would have two strong anti-war voices, and just any anti-war voices tend to break the dam up there. It's because it tends to unravel the system, and the deep state really requires no dissent. The more the dissenters, the more problems they have pushing through this money laundering, war adventurism in Ukraine that keeps escalating in a risk exposure. And maybe that's part of why Biden shifted to try to go after China and try to provoke something in China with saying that now he's going to weaponize American citizenship for it, et cetera. So I think there's definitely a correlation between the two. I think as we get into it, Republicans are in excellent position for the House and the Senate and the governorships.
Well, can I just say, Robert, you may be very interested to know that the one big international story covered by the Financial Times, which is, of course, the newspaper which the British establishment reads more than any other, by the way. They don't read the Times. Conservative Party people read the Telegraph because it's a kind of house journal. Labour Party people read the Guardian because it's a house journal. But if you really want to know what the deep state in Britain is thinking, you don't waste your time with the BBC, which is just a mouthpiece. You don't really just go to the Guardian, the Daily Telegraph. You go to the Financial Times, the big international story they've covered, other than Ukraine, but they devoted a whole big piece on it, was the midterms. And you could see the nervousness because they were saying back in the summer, it looked like the Democrats were pulling it back. They were winning back support. I don't know how true that ever really was, but the Financial Times has now admitted that's not happening, that the pendulum is swinging to the Republicans. The rest of the British media isn't reporting this at all. They're not talking about the midterms, but the Financial Times was. And of course, all of this in the middle of a massive political crisis here in Britain. Now, the thing to understand is if anti-war voices start getting traction in the United States, the political class in Europe and in Britain is in very serious trouble. The rug is pulled from under their feet. Because if you look at who's supplying weapons to Ukraine, overwhelmingly, I believe 80% of them are coming from the US. If you look at who's providing the intelligence, it is the US. If you look at who is providing the communication systems to Ukraine, the Starlink system, well, Starlink is Elon Musk and his organization. So that means the United States. Who proposed the sanctions, the economic war of attrition that the whole of Europe signed up to, and which is now taking us down an economic black hole? It all came from the Biden administration. So if that changes, if the ground shifts in America, well, the crisis, the political crisis in Europe, the sense that everything is going wrong, the sense that things are beginning to fall apart, simply cannot be overestimated. It will be bigger for the European elite than Trump's election in 2016, because they are so much more committed this time, and because the blowback for them has been so much greater. I read the US media, I read the European media, and I have to say this: the degree of political energy, of vitality, of diversity in the US is on an entirely different level from what you see in Europe. I was reading an article by somebody called David Sachs, I've never heard of him before, in Newsweek, talking about the need for a return to diplomacy. We have soldiers like Douglas McGregor, Daniel Davis, people like that, military people in the United States who provide intelligent and informed commentary about the war. Commentary I take extremely seriously, by the way. You have voices like Tucker Carlson. We have no one like that anywhere in Europe. No European state has an equivalent of Tucker Carlson. So if there is going to be a change, it is in the United States. And it's fascinating to see how in the United States you still have that political energy, which in Europe has completely gone away. And I will say also this personally, I don't just want a certain outcome in the midterms. It's not just that I want Republicans to win because I want anti-war voices to become strong in the United States. Important, very important, though that is. I'm going to say it. I consider this particular administration that we have now and all the people who are involved in it a danger and a threat to the world, to the United States, to the world, to the way things work. And I long for them to be stopped and blocked and pushed back, and in the end, to see them go. So I just wanted to say those things. Now, Robert, we've had inflation numbers coming in the United States. I don't take these numbers entirely seriously. By the way, I don't know whether John Williams at Shadow Stats is right or wrong about the specific numbers he's giving, but I'm sure that inflation is much higher than these official numbers say. What is the impact of all of that? Is that coming together with anti-war sentiment? Are people making that connection? Are they saying that the inflation numbers are as bad as they are because of the economic policy the Biden administration is pursuing and the foreign policy the Biden administration is pursuing? Is this coming together? Do people see this? Do they understand this in America?
Yeah, I mean, I think two things there. One is what we talked about early on was that support for the war was very shallow, not very deep. And that you could see this in public opinion and social commentary, that when you ask someone, how much are you willing to personally sacrifice for it? That tells you whether they're really for it or not. Otherwise, it just tells you they watch CNN and buy the news story, that they're moral heroes. But if they're not willing to say, yeah, I'm willing to pay higher gas prices, higher food prices, higher taxes, willing to volunteer myself, willing to support a draft for it. You need that kind of support for a war to have deep support. And early on, the polling was saying they weren't willing to even pay higher gas prices, even in Europe, outside of Western Germany, a few other places. They weren't willing to sacrifice at all for this. And we're seeing the consequences now that there are sacrificing for this. Mass protests throughout different parts of Europe that they try to suppress. Or my favorite one was pretending that the Macron protests were about climate change. It's like, okay, that's what they're protesting. All right. But in the United States, top issue, inflation. In fact, even Harry Enton at CNN acknowledged that whatever the top issue is and whichever party has an edge on that has translated into that party winning correspondingly to the upcoming elections. And Republicans have the biggest advantage on the top issue in the United States, which is inflation, that they've had since the 1980s on anything. So what you have is massive dominance, which suggests a massive sweep. Patrick Basham, who polls for the Democracy Institute, reports it in the Daily Express there in the UK. He projects one of the very few people to get Brexit right, one of the very few people to get Trump's 2016 election right, one of the very few people to say it's going to be very close in 2020. He projects 250 Republicans in the House. He projects 53 Republicans in the Senate. I lean in that's been, I have 52 in the Senate, but that's all. That's my only difference with him. And I go back and forth between 245 and 250 in the House, depending on individual races. The deep state has spent a lot of money and effort to try to sidetrack certain populist Republican candidates. So there was major efforts to sabotage Marjorie Taylor Greene. It worked in the case in the North Carolina race against him. Failed in all the other examples, but they're going after Lauren Boebert in Colorado. They're going after Paul Gosar in Arizona, and Marjorie Taylor Greene, of course. And then they've also tried to defund and put in a lot of black money cash, dark money cash, that money that's not trackable or traceable against both Blake Masters and J.D. Vance. Spent massive amounts of dark money saying, and J.D. Vance knew this was coming. It's one of the reasons he's like, all right, so, you're asking me to take this huge risk. I'm going to have all these people coming after me. And you know how much dark cash money that is. And we've seen it. And that's why their numbers have been kind of artificially low. But if you look at the broader context of recent elections, where incumbency is inconsequential in America, where every off-year midterm since 2006, when we had the big sort, as the book was called, we've had massive swings. The party out of presidential power has had massive wins in the midterms in 2006, again in 2010, again in 2014, again in 2018. There's no reason to believe that's going to be different in 2022. The media has been trying to do hit pieces on these various people, and they're trying to cover up for the candidate I call Uncle Festerman from Pennsylvania. Reality is even NBC had to admit the guy's having to read off a screen, read transcription of me asking him questions, the reporter asking questions right across there, and still got words wrong. He had a stroke, and that may be related to a certain shot he was proud of taking. Because the timing corresponds, and we've seen more reported incidents of that around the world. So I just don't, they can take shots at Dr. Oz in Pennsylvania, take shots at J.D. Vance, take shots at Blake Masters, big fake scandal about Herschel Walker in Georgia. And the Democratic snobbery is amazing. And here's a black candidate in the Senate, and there's a major publication that talks about how Herschel Walker can't talk right. It's like, wow, that would be racism if there was anybody, if this was somebody on the right talking about somebody on the left. In Georgia, they're just fine with how Herschel talks and how he played football. But so I think all of these places, Georgia will go to Walker, Pennsylvania will go to Oz, Wisconsin will go to Johnson, Ohio will go to Vance, Arizona will go to Masters, Nevada will go to Laxalt. And despite all the dark money spent against a lot of these guys because they refuse to jump on the Ukrainian bandwagon, when they win, it's going to be a huge boost, not that's for Republicans, but for the anti-war cause, because these are guys who stood up to the deep state agenda, either didn't embrace it or publicly attacked it, and still won despite massive money coming in against them and media hit jobs coming in against them. So I think that, and that's why they're nervous. They convinced themselves for a little while that they could win. You had New York Times pieces saying 1 in 3 chance Democrats will hold the House, 3/4 chance Democrats will hold the Senate. This was naivete. This was going against all the public data, because you point that the big issues right now are inflation, the economy in general, and issues related to inflation or the economy, whether it's called jobs, whether it's called immigration, whether it's called crime, things that are kind of derivative of that. Basically, the only issue Democrats are winning on are issues that only Democrats consider important. For example, they really thought abortion was going to be this massive winner for them. When you look at how many swing voters, independent voters, Republicans who occasionally vote Democrat, Democrats who occasionally vote Republican, what they think of abortion, it's like number 9 on the list. It's nowhere near top. And as you know, Shadow Stats, for those folks out there, they use the same metric we used to use. So we changed our metric. So he says, well, if we were using the 1970s metric, what would inflation look like? If we were using the 1980s metric, it shows everybody what the different metrics look like, using what used to be the government's own formula. And what it shows us is that we have a late 1970s, early 1980s economy right now. We have classic stagflation. We have the job growth that's taking place that Biden keeps bragging about is people taking second and third jobs. You can see that in the labor force participation rate, which is still flat. It's not going up. That means more people aren't working. So what is more people are working more jobs. That's not a good thing. The wages are not keeping track at all with core inflation. So, like, for example, this past week, core inflation was reported at the highest rate it has since 1982. And for those, that's your everyday products. If you dig deeper into that, it gets worse. If you look at the kind of things people buy on an everyday basis, milk, bacon, meat, core groceries, those kind of items, inflation is in the 20% or higher. So that's I'll give you an example. Halloween candy is going to be 13% higher. These are the kind of things ordinary everyday people do. Ordinary everyday people aren't buying luxury vehicles. Ordinary everyday people actually would like housing to stay up high because that's their main asset. So housing going down is not good for them. But they're not buying tons of luxury clothes and other kind of luxury goods. The kind of things that people thought Russia couldn't survive without. Man, how are they going to survive if they don't have Gucci? That kind of mindset. Well, in America, the core costs are way higher than they are actually in Russia in terms of how they've gone for cost over the last year. And Biden has not been able to get a control of that. Fed hasn't been able to get a control of that. And the way they're trying to control it is sinking the stock market and is risking the stock market and sinking the housing market. And for those folks out there, the way the housing market, it matters even more than the stock market. Stock market's often perception of influence, perception of economy, et cetera. But in the housing market, the number one source of disposable income in the last several years has been people getting refis. People looking at, my equity went up in my house. I'll refinance my house. I'll get another 60 grand of equity out of it, and I'll spend it on other goods. Refis are one of the lowest levels they've been in a decade. So, in fact, all the housing red flags look like 07, 08. And that doesn't even get into the financial crisis issues that are looming all over the place. Whether it's what's happening in the UK, we're seeing similar signs in the US. Keep things like that every week, every day, I get some economic or housing or other analyst tell me, by the way, this data point is the worst it's been since 2007, worst it's been since 2008, worst it's been. It's all tied to the global financial crisis and how well we can manage all that, given we have comparable pension problems in the United States, state pension problems, others, underfunded pensions, pensions that relied on certain levels of interest rates that are not available, et cetera. It's all looking bad. So because Biden couldn't reverse the economic data, and the economic data is driving it, and to the degree there's secondary issues, it's either immigration, where he's not doing well, or it's crime, where he's not doing well, and Democrats in general not doing well, or it's what you could call wokeness, particularly as to schools. All this attempt to force feed. When people were shocked to discover their 5-year-old is being taught that maybe they're a different gender in their public school. People were like, "Oh, well, hold on a second," or even being talked about that you had a teacher talking to 6-year-olds and then bragging about later on TikTok about their sexual life. And it's like, that's not an American ordinary byway and tradition. This is not okay. So, and then you see Biden, constantly emptying out the strategic petroleum reserves to try to deflate the oil cost, while mismanaging things in Saudi Arabia such that they're not willing to go along with him, begging them to delay their cut until after the midterms. Again, openly. When's the last time you saw the Saudis out someone like the American president like that? You're seeing complete disregard, disrespect, dislike for this very dangerous administration. And so all of it points to Republican sweeps in the House, Republican sweeps in the Senate, Republican sweeps. I think they'll pick up some governorships they don't expect them to. And why that matters to a lot of Democrats is those are states where Republicans already control the state legislature, and they will control the rules for the 2024 election. It was critical to them in the 2020 election that Democrats controlled Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania from the gubernatorial level, and they had co-opted key officials in Georgia and Arizona. Legal reforms have already passed in Georgia and Arizona. So they need to hold all 3 governorships in those 3 Midwestern states where Republicans already will have a majority in the state legislature. And I think they're behind in Wisconsin, and I still think they lose 2 of the 3. I'd say guaranteed almost they lose 1 of the 3, probably Wisconsin. But I think Pennsylvania, despite lots of efforts to protect the Democrats in Pennsylvania and Michigan, I'm not sold that it'll ultimately prevail. Now, there can be governorships can go differently than the national direction because of state pertinent issues. And we'll see. Michigan has abortion on the ballot. That may help Democrats. We'll find out. But the overall, it looks bad for Democrats for the House and the Senate, the Biden administration. And it came out leaked yesterday. I guess they thought this was bad news. The Republicans like to hear this. Conservatives like to hear this. Republicans saying what they're going to do with it. And what they're going to do with it as soon as they get the House is they're going to impeach a bunch of people in the Biden administration. They're going to open up investigations into Hunter Biden more publicly, more prominently, more directly. They're going to go investigations into big tech collusion. They're going to get in. Now, I don't think they have the cojones to get into issues related to Ukraine unless the right people have committee positions. If say Rand Paul is in a certain position and Vance and Masters are on that committee, then that might change things. But basically, and then there's going to be investigations into the weaponization of the legal system by the Biden administration, which has just got worse since we last talked. Going after Steve Wynn, going after a person trying to buy CNN because he's Trump affiliated with questionable tax claims, the acceleration of things against Trump, the continued show trials January 6th, the cover-up efforts by Duran in the Danchenko trial. So the all of it points to, but either way, Biden administration in deep, deep trouble. And I don't know, and I don't think Ukraine can save them if Republicans sweep like it looks like they will in the House.
Absolutely. Can I just say that for me, personally, this whole affair, this inflation crisis, this administration that we have, it's a particularly ghastly rerun of what I remember in the 1970s. Now, when I say ghastly rerun, I mean it's much worse than what happened in the 1970s. Can I just say, make a point? This inflation crisis that we have now is the product of reckless, irresponsible economic policies by a Democrat administration. the inflation crisis we had in the 1970s was also the result of irresponsible and reckless financial policies, economic policies by a Democrat administration, a much more impressive Democrat administration. But the point to understand is that in the 1960s, the US government, the Lyndon Johnson administration, overspent in reckless ways. It spent money on the Great Society program. It spent money on the arms race with the Soviets. It spent money in Vietnam. It spent money on all kinds of social programs that caused a huge financial overhang that led eventually to concerns, international concerns about the stability of the dollar, which forced it to sever its connection to gold in 1971 and become a fiat currency. And of course, it triggered that huge inflation problem that we had in the 1970s. And the extraordinary thing is that the Biden administration has done all the same things at about 5 times the speed that LBJ and the Democrats did in the 60s. I mean, it's quite remarkable to watch. I mean, they've spent more money. They've turbocharged the economy even more. They've tried to do everything as they said. They tried to run the economy hot. They were even saying this. They've spent more money on programs, on weapons, on supporting Ukraine. They've created more international tensions. Even LBJ and his most reckless officials would be out of breath trying to keep up with these people. And the other thing to understand about this particular inflation crisis, which we are seeing now, is that when people talk about, as they have been, that people are taking out second jobs and, production is rising in certain industries, that is also a product of inflation. It's not a sign of a good economy. It's a sign of an increasingly unstable economy. The reason people are taking out second and third jobs is because they have to. They have to do that in order to balance their household budgets. It means that they're working more, they have less leisure time, and leisure is something we all deserve and need. It's part of, the good life, the living standards we should be having. And of course, if businesses are producing because they have no choice, because otherwise their cash flow would collapse, because their costs are rising, that is a very, very bad thing. And again, I remember that from the 1970s. So it's a problem that is getting worse all the time. And as I said, I've seen it, I've lived it, I remember how bad it got. And of course, eventually in the 1980s, for all kinds of complicated reasons I'm not going to discuss now, it eventually unscrambled itself. I'm not so convinced it's going to unscramble itself in the same way now. But that makes me ask this fundamental question. How is it possible, given how bad the situation is in the United States now, that the Democrats, that this administration continues to have the support that it does? Because logically, looking at what it's been doing, looking at how bad things are, looking at how dangerous they are, you would have expected that the entire political position of the administration ought to be collapsing by this point. So that's one question I do want to put, Robert, to you. But when we come to that, but I'm also very glad to hear you say that it's not just Biden himself that is now being targeted for potential impeachment, but other US officials, parts of the administration, who are abusing their positions. And one person I have to ask about, I wonder what your answer is going to be, is Merrick Garland, because he is behaving in a way that I have never seen an Attorney General of the United States act before. I mean, even Nixon's Attorney General, I can't even remember his name now. Was it Mitchell? I can't remember what his name was. But, who got caught up in the Watergate scandal. I mean, it wasn't what he did wasn't part of his work as the Attorney General. This Attorney General is using the Justice Department to go after the president's opponents. And I have to say, I find that unbelievable. And that's only one part of the bad things that he is doing. So is there any talk of coming after Garland? Just asking. I mean, maybe not, but just asking. And how do you explain this continued support that the Democrats appear to have, given how bad the situation is becoming?
Yeah, so sort of a triple track of questions there. The first to the housing, no question. I mean, Margaret Thatcher, one of her great ingenious moves was making housing more accessible in the UK. The reason why George W. Bush boosted the housing market, inflated it, created a housing bubble, was in part because house ownership is something people feel really proud of. They love to own their own home as a matter of separate from independent wealth creation, as a matter of pride, as a matter of honor. It's owning their own property. And in the United States, to give an example for people, within just a year, the average cost to buy a home has basically doubled. So when you add the mortgage cost to the housing price increase, that's what's happened. So you're seeing a sudden shrinkage of housing inventory coming back offline where it was going back online. Restriction of construction, which of course has has ramifications throughout the economy. People not willing to refi their houses because it costs so much more now to do so. And as the person in the super chat pointed out, increasingly we're no longer a housing-owned society. BlackRock, owns a lot of American homes, and we're renters. Well, it's even worse there. Some of the rent increases are double, triple, quadruple the inflation rate increase in many communities that are making it utterly unaffordable for people to rent homes. So the housing market looks bad. Housing prices have started to tumble. They will probably continue to tumble, but with high interest rates still unaffordable and inaccessible, such that there won't be a lot of construction going on, which is going to create its own set of issues, and the inability to tap equity for the purposes of refi for those that already own their own homes, which impacts dramatically discretionary income spending in the economy. On the dollar, the other thing is we have a worst case scenario. The dollar can be weak inside the U.S. economy in terms of inflation and crazy strong outside the U.S. economy. The U.S. dollar has hogged up so much of global transactions, so much of global debt, so much of sovereign debt, that as the dollar surges in the global markets because of this global instability, it's creating all kinds of problems for economies all around the world. It's one of the reasons that Putin has been looking at creating an alternative currency. It's not just staying out of the sanctions economy that the West wants to impose on Russia. It's also, this is just a problem. The dollar came to dominate too much, whether you call it the euro dollar system like Jeff Snyder. You talk about the dollar milkshake that others have talked about, George Gammon, Mark Moss, and others. Whichever it is you're talking about, you've just got a systemic problem that may trigger cascading global defaults of sovereign debt. And then a wide range of other issues for the economies tied to it. And Biden was bragging about this yesterday for some reason. He's like, oh, don't worry about this. It's like, why? This is not a good sign. It doesn't help you domestically because the dollar is weak here with inflation. And it just causes a wide range of global potential catastrophes there. So that I haven't seen any apparent solution to that. And it's at least interpreted in Europe and elsewhere that this is a deliberate Fed policy. They see raising interest rates as increasing the value of the dollar globally, which is further hurting and impairing their economies. You got Japan, Bank of Japan doing things they've never done before. You got the European Central Bank talking about things that they didn't want to do. You have all the problems with the Bank of England, which apparently thinks its solution is regime change. But not going to solve it. These problems have been institutionalized. And then you got countries like Saudi Arabia and elsewhere trying to exit the whole thing, trying to find a different path because the U.S. is obsessed with yipping about that, fake reporter for the Washington Post who, made the mistake of going into a place and asking for a marriage license and coming out in pieces. Unfortunate for him. Bad idea. And it appears, the whole solution ultimately is going to be Turkey with more political power as they get to not only control the migrant flow into Europe, but control the oil flow, natural gas flow into Europe. Congratulations. Good job on that. And I did love Macron complaining about the U.S. charging 4 times more for liquid natural gas in France than it is in the U.S. And it's like, yeah, that's because liquid natural gas is very expensive to transport by ship and to redo it all the way over. I mean, I get people being critical of the U.S. about it, can be, but that's really not profit gouging. That's the cost is way higher than pipeline gas. I mean, how do they not think of this beforehand? You know, who knows? But maybe America, you know, when the Vikings were here in the 1100s, wanted to join the EU the way Ukraine did in 995 or whatever it was, with their latest Ukrainian trip through Ukrainian history. It's like drunk history, but wrong. Is Ukrainian history from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. We joined the EU, and the Kiev and Rus were here. There wasn't even a Ukraine then, but okay. So you know, that's on those two sides. But you're right. The big one is Garland. They're looking at two people primarily, maybe three. The reason why Fauci's running away in part is so he won't be one of the three that's impeached, because he would have been one of them, or at least major investigations into him. And those investigations may still occur. Fauci, thanks to Robert Kennedy Jr., movie out today about his book, documentary out today about his Real Anthony Fauci book that was very big, that details that this guy's got a long, notorious, ugly history of this kind of conduct. But the head of HHS, because of issues about lying about Border Patrol guards, claiming that they're whipping immigrants, and all the other issues related to immigration, definitely going to be a high-profile target. And the other one is Merrick Garland. And the issues concerning Garland are going after Trump the way he did, how he's handled the January 6th defendants the way he has, him trying to wrap up Durham's investigation to make sure it didn't go further than where I don't think Durham was going to take it anyway, but made sure that it didn't get to high-ranking actors who were corrupt in the Russiagate scandal. I mean, it came out the FBI was offering $1 million to Christopher Steele to drum up fake evidence against a presidential candidate and then president. It's like our own FBI was willing to spend huge amounts of money, and then they're putting tons of people on the informant payroll that were producing bogus information, that they knew were producing bogus information. When they produced honest information, when one of the informants ratted out the other informant, they kept him as an informant to hide it from the Congress, what took place. They're like, oh, it's a confidential source. We can't get into that. It's classified information. Of course, as usual, always cover up their crimes through secrets. That's what Assange really nailed the truth of. And then it's escalated. For example, one of the media moguls buying CNN that wants to return CNN to at least some version of journalistic coverage and not just partisan hackery. All of a sudden, his company gets hit by the Biden administration for like a $300 million tax fine, alleging there's some tax due. And this follows and succeeds them going after Steve Wynn in a way that they said Wynn has to register as a foreign agent for China. And it was solely based on what happened 5 years ago when Wynn, had tight ties to the Trump administration, the Chinese government allegedly asked him to lobby to prevent a Chinese citizen in the U.S. from getting another visa. There was some political dispute there. He did so, and in exchange, according to the allegations, China was not going to be as harsh with his casino in Macau, which is much more lucrative, by the way, than his one in Las Vegas. But that was back in 2017. Wynn then withdrew from it. Wynn has been kicked because of a Me Too movement led by his ex-wife and Democrats who didn't like the fact that he was so heavily supporting Trump, who was removed from Wynn entirely. Doesn't run it or own it now. So there's no bearing, no relationship to this. So why bring it? Solely to embarrass him, solely to humiliate another, to weaponize the legal system, to remove or stain or shame a political dissident with influence. Of course, they're going after Mike Lindell. So basically, if you have money and you're connected to Trump, or you're real active and connected to Trump, you've been put under criminal or civil investigation, one way, shape, or form, by the Biden administration, led by Merrick Garland. We had Mike Davis on last week on Sidebar, good friends with Justice Gorsuch. He was someone who liked Garland, thought Garland would be okay as the director, and he says the sources he has in the District of Columbia are that Garland is running this to a T. This is, and he said he's shocked. A lot of other people are shocked. So given the customs and precedents that have been breached, it is highly likely that Garland will be put under meaningful investigation. Now, I don't think they'll have the cojones to go back to what he did at Oklahoma City and look into some things. I mean, if you knew Garland and his ties to Oklahoma City, hiding information and discovery, hiding the fact of government informants being connected to certain part, Elohim City, and so forth, being connected to McVeigh being ex-military. There are a lot of things that the government suppressed concerning that trial that might have put a different hue on what took place and who was a culprit. And Garland managed that whole thing. So that, in terms of the cover-up aspect of the operation, some of us are not surprised at who Garland is, but DC is. The DC Republicans are surprised. They did not think he would overtly, openly weaponize this. And if Republican sees the House, Republican sees the Senate, Republicans do well in the states for legislative and gubernatorial offices, Trump's going to be in the driver's seat. Even Megyn Kelly was on Dave Rubin the other day, admitted nobody can beat Trump. This Paul Ryan is putting out and Frank Luntz is putting out, oh, Trump's not going to be even on the ticket in 2024. That's just pure delusional thought. Trump has a massive lead, and Trump is the guy that's the lead public official, as Noam Chomsky identified, that's been calling for peace now for 6 months straight and being more open. It's now part of his stump speech. Every speech he gives, and that tells you where the zeitgeist is in the Republican populist wing. So I think that you'll see a push in that direction. I think a lot of how Garland has handled the Hunter Biden investigation will be part of this too. So all of this overt, open political weaponization of the legal justice process will do it. And a guy whose name might surprise people that might come up in this context is Elon Musk.
Absolutely. Well, I'm going to ask you a lot about Elon Musk, who's a person I know very little about in a strange way, because he's suddenly become quite interesting. But I just wanted to say this. I have to say, I really do hope that there's a proper investigation of Garland. You said that there are people, Republicans, who are shocked. To say that I am shocked by the conduct of Garland would be a complete and massive understatement. I'm horrified by it. Has there ever in history been a situation when the Attorney General of the United States has been impeached? Because I can't think of one, and I can't think of a situation where it is deserved in the way that it clearly is in this case. And I also wanted to say a few things that coming back to some of the points that you've been making about Durham, for example. I mean, you've been saying for some time that you don't think that Durham is really taking this anywhere very far. I've been following the Danchenko case to the extent that I can do. I get the sense of an incredibly underpowered prosecution. I mean, that's an understatement. I mean, a prosecution which is being conducted without any true sense of conviction at all, and which I am fairly confident, because of the way it's going to be conducted, is going to end in an acquittal, which, I mean, is incredible to me, given the known facts. And I would just point out one particular known fact. You mentioned that I think it was Christopher Steele was offered $1 million by the FBI. Now, I read Horowitz. You remember the Inspector General of the FBI? He did all those reports. There's absolutely nothing about that there. Nothing about the fact that, Christopher Steele had all that money being offered to him. So did Horowitz conceal that? That wasn't the impression I got from reading his reports. I got the impression that Horowitz was an honorable man trying to do his best, in which case the FBI must have been lying to their own Inspector General, because this is surely an enormously relevant issue for those reports that Horowitz was writing. And where is Durham talking about that? Why isn't Durham pursuing all of these people? I understand that some of these cases against FBI officials still fall within the statute of limitations, but he's doing absolutely nothing about it. So, I mean, I have to say, I was incredulous. I'm very depressed. I may be getting this wrong, but I'm very depressed by the whole Danchenko prosecution. You were telling us, Robert, months ago, this isn't going to go anywhere. It seems to me you are right.
Yeah, sadly so. And it reflected two things. One, Durham's history. So, Durham got credit for the Whitey Bulger expose of FBI agents in Boston. What people did not know is what he was really there to do was to shift the blame to a rogue agent or two and hide the fact that the lead U.S. attorney there that was running mob investigations was actually implicated. The short answer is the FBI chose the Whitey Bulger's group over other groups in terms of engaging in criminal activity. Whitey Bulger wasn't really an informant. They falsely listed him as one in order to protect him. And in fact, the Whitey Bulger had a deal with the U.S. attorney running the anti-mob cases to provide personal protection from assassination. So what you had was the FBI in the mob business, in the organized crime business, which study FBI long enough, not really a shock or surprise, sadly. But that's what Durham was really there to do, was to shift the blame from the Whitey Bulger tried to get into this in his criminal trial. It's the only reason he went to trial. They basically foreclosed him from getting into it because he wanted to expose, I was never a rat. I was never an informant. I was the FBI's agent, effectively. They wanted me engaged in this kind of organized crime to compete with their real target, which was the Italian mob organizations in particular in Boston, and to protect their own people in the process, and helped elicit and then helped, fraudulently forge charges against other people, set up other people for crimes that Whitey Bulger committed as part of this. This is how expansive it was, while getting, nice little bonuses on the side. So kind of like the FBI agent who just got convicted in LA that the media completely suppressed the story of. This was a National Security Division guy, high-ranking guy. He was working for the Armenian mob. So he forgot that he got a Ducati as a gift. Who forgets they got a Ducati? I can forget getting a Ford maybe, or a Fiat, but you forget you got a Ducati. I mean, that's how crazy that guy's lifestyle was. Institutional media totally suppressed how deep that corruption goes, and that's who Durham is. He did it. He really showed his cards in the CIA Guantanamo case about torture, where the John Brennan and others illicitly spied on the United States Senate, no less. Durham was the one who hushed all that up, never brought any charges. And so when he was chosen by Bill Barr, given Bill Barr's history, which I did a hush-hush on Bill Barr and the extraordinary history, you can find it at vivabarneslaw.locals.com, including a certain agency his father may have worked for in the 1940s. But basically, Durham was a cover-up artist, and it was clear with the Kleinsmith prosecution, because there you have a high-ranking FBI lawyer who is perjuring affidavits and declarations to the national security court we have here, the FISA court, Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act court. It's supposed to be limiting the intelligence community. Of course, it's their tool, sadly, but that's another story for another day. And he got to walk. He got to do no time at all. He was reinstated to the bar within about 9 months or a year. Isn't it amazing? The people that, suppose the bar cares about the ethics of the profession, and that's why they always have to go after these dissident lawyers. But a government lawyer gets caught perjuring documents that lead to spying on an opposing presidential candidate and an American citizen without lawful basis, and he gets reinstated as soon as his probation sentence is up. Isn't that nice? In the District of Columbia. While the same District of Columbia is trying to disbar Rudy Giuliani for merely talking about the elections in public, not even some of his legal actions. Like, wow. Tells you who and what they're really about. And you see DC, they're asking that Steve Bannon get a 6-month jail sentence on Friday. So Steve Bannon, who objected to a lawless congressional committee going after him, is supposed to serve 6 months in jail, the maximum possible sentence, while Kleinsmith, who actually committed a felony, didn't serve a day in jail. Nothing exposes the disparity of the discrepancy than that about where Durham really was going. Because Kleinsmith's the guy you flip and get him. He could rat out Peter Strzok. He could rat out James Comey. He could rat out everybody. And when that didn't happen, that meant, okay, we're back to old Durham. This is an effort to cover up the FBI's crimes, not expose them, and blame outsiders for saying, by golly, they just got fooled by these half-wit, nitwit, our man in Havana types. I mean, people that would make the Taylor of Panama look like a genius source of institutional credibility, some of these people. I mean, some of their stories were so ludicrous, so laughable, so bad. Danchenko, the reason why they had to hide him and keep him on the payroll was because he told them, oh, by the way, the dossier is all crap. That Steele dossier, that's just crap. They're like, oh, okay, we got to hide that from everybody, hide that from Congress. The Mueller committee complicit in hiring it up, covering it up. So, yeah, sadly, Danchenko proves that Durham was always going to be a no-go. But if Republicans take back the House and the Senate, that will change. And if someone like Trump wins in 2024, Trump is a person who believes in revenge. You can agree or disagree with his principle on that, but he's very open about this. Frankly, the reason he's running is revenge. I think if he thought from my talking to him at the time of the 2020 election, if he thought he lost, he was just going to say, hey, cool, I had fun, time to retire, time to, go to the golf course, do what I want, not deal with all this nonsense and, New York trying to bar him from ever doing business and bankrupt him, not deal with any of that stuff. All that stuff would go away, as he publicly has said the moment he quits politics. They're going after Trump, not just because he's Trump. They're going after Trump because they want to set an example, just like they went after Ross Perot back in the 90s for this. They don't want any people sticking their head up saying they're going to challenge the system at any level. They can't afford it. They've monopolized and corrupted the political class so bad that we have, 3/4 of the House voting for money to a foreign country in the middle of an economic crisis that the American people would never vote for. So they want to keep that corruption. And Trump, whatever you think of him, presents a challenge to that deep state corruption because he operates off of his instinct and intuition. And that instinct and intuition often is in alignment with the deep state policies and protocols. So I think we'll see that. And I think that's really the kind of the story behind Elon Musk as well, that Musk is trying to play Trump-like against the system because I think he offended the Biden administration about something. They wanted him to do something he didn't want to do. And I think everything we've seen from him publicly has been about him getting ahead of the fact that the Biden administration has targeted him for some reason. Even before Twitter, before Starlink in Ukraine, before all of that, I think now he has a whole host of critics, people that have been short selling him forever. There may be corruption tied to that in the investigation. But there was leaks and rumors and whispers of a major Biden criminal investigation. And it appears the Biden administration was trying to weaponize their criminal justice power to try to force Musk to do their bidding on a range of topics. Maybe that means incorporating Starlink more affirmatively in a U.S. military surveillance project or for use in cases of the Ukraine conflict. Maybe that's something else we don't know about globally or domestically. But Musk suddenly had an interest in aspects of free speech in Twitter at the same time these rumors of Biden coming after him were. And my theory then, in a hush-hush that I talked about at vivabarneslaw.locals.com, was that Musk is wanting to get ahead of the story. He's like, and wants counter leverage. He's like, okay, the Biden administration wants to take me out. How could I get Republican and conservative allies in the court of public opinion? How could I get leverage against the Biden administration? Maybe I'll buy Twitter. And I think that's what a lot of that was. It looks like he's going to go through with that. But I think also he was trying to bide his time on the Starlink Ukraine thing. Look how great Starlink is. It works in Ukraine, et cetera. Some of us were a little skeptical how well it was working, given certain things you needed. But that's Musk. Musk is a great marketer. He doesn't worry about details. Never has. Good, bad, or otherwise. That's just Musk makes Trump look like a cheap salesman by comparison. Nobody sells like Musk sells. He sells automated cars before we have anything vaguely resembling automated cars. But and that's why a lot of people have short sold him. But those short sellers sure haven't made a lot of money betting against him. But you look at his shift. I don't know what caused it. Whether it's he's not getting what he wants from the Biden administration. Whether there were allegations or claims that Russia was, going to start really interfering with and making life difficult for Starlink, which they absolutely could do. All of a sudden, he was like, "Hey, maybe we should have peace." There's these referendums. Let's see if the referendums are legit. If they are legit, Russia kind of thinks Crimea is theirs anyway. Do we really want to get to nuclear Armageddon? That seems like a dumb idea. And can I please get paid for Starlink and Ukraine rather than keep having to deal with it? And then the Ukrainians expose their hand. They go nuts on the guy. The guy's been providing free satellite services for months and promoting your conflict. And you go nuts on him the moment he says, maybe there should be peace. Maybe we should recognize referendums. I mean, that's it. Well, it was just an idea proposal. And one of them said that he needed to F off. And he was like, okay, I'll pull Starlink. I'll accommodate your request, which they didn't like, of course. So I think there's a backstory there of the Biden administration trying to weaponize the legal system so aggressively that they're trying to coerce every powerful individual or institution to their will. And they're trying to fight back the best way they know how. and that Musk found himself in the middle of all this, but it ended up exposing the insanity of the Ukrainian conflict in the process, because a guy just says, maybe we should talk about peace, and he gets widely attacked after being one of the most generous donors to the Ukrainian cause around.
Absolutely. Can I just say, I mean, I was trying to go through all the various tweets. I found that some of them have been deleted. Now, I don't know exactly what's been going on. I floated a particular theory of my own on my own channel. I think that there are problems with Starlink, and I think the Russians are targeting it. That's my own personal view. But about one thing, I'm absolutely sure, Robert, you are right. There is a massive row going on here between Musk and someone. I don't think it's Ukraine, actually. I think it's someone within the American system. I mean, clearly, he is very unhappy. He feels that he's been maneuvered into a position with which he finds himself extremely uncomfortable. And he's being extremely careful in what he says in his tweets, because he's not telling us everything, not by any means. But something has happened, something has snapped, and he is very, very angry. And as I said, everything points to a colossal row. I do think, as I said, it's something to do with Ukraine. I do think it's something to do with Starlink. These are guesses. There may be other things too. It probably goes back some way, and I'm sure Twitter, and he's on 1 minute, off the next minute, on again. Purchase of Twitter has some connection to all of this as well. Can I just ask, you're talking about persecution of individuals, people who represent dissent in the United States, the justice system being used in an incredibly aggressive way. Can I ask you to tell us about what's happening with Alex Jones? Because, again, I may not be up to date with all of this, but I saw more talks of more insane fines, which I just cannot compute these numbers anymore. I mean, in themselves, they look to me incredibly oppressive. And I think I mentioned the Nicholas Tolstoy case in another program which we did, when Nicholas Tolstoy was ordered to pay damages in a defamation action, and the European Court of Human Rights said this was a violation of his human right of freedom of speech, because it was clearly intended to intimidate and silence him. Anyway, what is going on at the moment with Alex Jones?
Yeah, so it's the insanity continues. So Jones was denied the right to bring certain procedural remedies, rights to bring motions to dismiss, rights to bring what's called anti-SLAPP motions, the right to bring summary judgment motions in many of these proceedings. He was also denied at trial the opportunity to even say he was innocent. He was told that he would be held in contempt of court and be jailed for up to 6 months if he said he was innocent. Told he would be jailed if he contested any of the claims of the plaintiffs, pretty much. He wasn't allowed to tell the jury all the different times he had apologized to the families. Wasn't allowed to tell the jury the fact he almost never covered Sandy Hook. Wasn't allowed to tell the jury that most of what InfoWars covered with Sandy Hook said Sandy Hook happened. Wasn't allowed to tell the jury he had nothing to do with all these claims of other people challenging family members. None of them came from him. In fact, as was exposed at trial, all of that was happening long before Jones said anything about Sandy Hook not existing or challenging or contesting or questioning Sandy Hook. Wasn't so basically it was hey, here's some families that have suffered. Here's the only person you're allowed to blame for this. It was a very much a scripted show trial in the old Soviet Stasi show trial kind of way. And then how much asked for damages. Now, historically around the world, average damages for someone that hasn't suffered unique reputational damages, market damages. There was no testimony of that. There was no even expert testimony as to emotional distress damages. Is for what you could normally call nominal damages. The average in America is less than $100,000 per person. Here, they were ordering over $100 million per person. They ordered over $1 billion. It was the laughably absurd verdict. I called it the clown verdict of a show trial. That was a disgrace to American civil justice from beginning to end. The worst and most egregious example is, for those people out there might be real sympathetic to the Sandy Hook families, real critical of Alex Jones, One of the people who is going to get over $100 million, $90 million is the basic verdict, and then it's going to be added to, is an FBI lawyer who had no family that died there, knows nobody who died there. Well, wasn't affiliated. He was simply an FBI lawyer who was investigating the case. Who admitted on the stand he couldn't identify anything Alex Jones had ever said about him, ever talked about him, ever even shown his image and talked about his image, ever. In America, what's called the constitutional requirement of colloquium for First Amendment purposes. It parallels that European court decision you're referencing, and that the idea is that the state court systems of America cannot weaponize tort law to censor speech, to punish speech. This is a $1 billion punishment of speech. And here, there's no better example of it than the FBI agent, and it's going to end up being like $2 billion when they're all done calculating. That's how nuts it is. Is that an FBI agent is being awarded a huge amount of money who was never talked about, never referenced by name, never shown by image, admitted that all of it started long before Alex Jones said anything about this particular topic, the Sandy Hook denial theory that was being discussed in the case. And so now basically America has set a precedent that said if you challenge what happened in a major event, you can be sued into oblivion. So now someone like Alexander Vindman can sue somebody saying you caused me emotional distress by challenging what's happening in Ukraine. I mean that's the legal door they opened. They will not allow.
What was the FBI? Can you just explain this FBI guy, Robert? What was his problem? Like, what was his claim?
He was.
I don't understand that.
Yeah, exactly. His claim was that Alex Jones questioned who the FBI blamed for Sandy Hook. That led, in his view, to people questioning him personally, and that caused him emotional distress and somehow consumer damages. That was the craziest claim. They now said that if you sell a product, you can be sued for your speech unrelated to the product. That's how nuts the case was. No precedent for that ever in the history of America. And people still think Alex Jones defaulted. Just watch any part of the trial. They had all the evidence they could ever use. Alex Jones produced more discovery in that case than any defendant in a media case in history. I've openly challenged the media, openly challenged other lawyers out there. Find me one other case where any media defendant produced as much discovery as Jones did. You won't find a single case where somebody was defaulted, denied their right to trial by jury on the merits, under threat of contempt if you testify in a certain way. That has happened in a like case. No one has found a single case like it because it's never existed before in America. It's the court system using these loopholes like default judgments to get around constitutional rights to trial by jury. Why? Because they knew if the whole truth was known, plaintiffs would lose their case and definitely not get anywhere near the kind of crazy verdict they were getting. But so the FBI guy says, you said what happened is different than we, the FBI. That causes me emotional distress. I get to sue you for it. It's creating a legally protected safe space and say these people, if they have any connection to an incident or whatever of any kind, and you say something that offends them, they get to sue you into oblivion. To give you an idea how dangerous it is already now being threatened against Kanye West. So Kanye said, I don't think George Floyd died from the knee. I think he died because of the drugs that were in the system. I don't think the cops caused his death. That was the defense, by the way, at trial, for which there was plenty of medical evidence for their side. You can disagree with it, but it's not like it was without merit. Well, now George Floyd's family is thinking about suing Kanye West using the Alex Jones precedent explicitly for $1 billion. So this is an attempt to wipe out free speech of dissidents in America, weaponize the legal system, strip someone of their procedural rights, strip someone of their substantive rights to trial by jury, strip someone of their ability to even say they're innocent under threat by misusing and abusing contempt power, misuse, abuse, default power, misuse and abuse contempt power. This is the same Connecticut judge, by the way, that said because Jones had been publicly critical of the lawyers outside of court on his TV station in Texas, he could not be allowed to pursue an anti-SLAPP motion in Connecticut. Also unprecedented. Goes against what Harry Bridges, famous labor guy, basically told a court to go screw off when it said it was going to enjoin a labor movement, a labor strike. He's like, yeah, good. You put your writing on paper, you can buzz off. Judge got mad, held him in contempt, went up to the Supreme Court. U.S. Supreme Court said, you can't do that. That's out-of-court speech. You can't punish out-of-court speech that way. And yet that's exactly what happened to Alex Jones. So the Alex Jones precedent poses imminent risk to free speech and free expression and free association and free press in America. and they're going to start weaponizing it everywhere. And you're going to see inconsistency. Like, for example, I have a case for the Covington kids pending in the Kentucky appellate court system, where the Kentucky appellate court system created a unique rule that said you can't sue anybody in Kentucky for defamation unless they were physically present in Kentucky when they did it. Even if they published it in Kentucky about Kentuckians meant to hurt Kentuckians. Why? It's because there's one set of rules. Rachel Maddow can't sue her for lying about a station, saying that One America News Network was literally a Russian agent, and said, oh, you can't sue because that's just pure protected opinion. So-called fact checkers, Candace Owens, John Stossel, both brought suit. And what are courts saying? Oh, you can't sue. Nobody would ever think a fact check is about a fact. I mean, extraordinary statement to make. So you're seeing the court system just weaponized openly, overtly, purely based on what political label the party is there, and now being weaponized in unique ways that it's never been done before to bankrupt people for dissident speech. And that's the dangerous precedent of Alex Jones. And a lot of people haven't paid attention in the legal world because there's a big class gap in who follows Alex Jones. Alex Jones's audience is a much bigger audience than people realize. For those people that don't really know him out there globally, Alex Jones is the most loudest voice on the right that's been anti-war, anti-surveillance state, pro-Julian Assange, pro-Edward Snowden. That's what distinguishes him from Rush Limbaugh. And not his popularity. According to YouGov, more than 30 million Americans have a very favorable view of him. Amongst Trump voters, they prefer InfoWars as a source to the New York Times, which, by the way, is what partially enrages all these people. The New York Times is a media person that just writes hit pieces on Jones day after day after day. Jones is a big populist voice that's anti-deep state, anti-war. You can disagree with him on whatever you want. His style, he's become a meme in his style. Very entertaining. But the working class, big part of the working class populist right in America loves the guy. And he's their primary source. And they explicitly admitted their goal was to shut him up. Plaintiff's lawyer walks out after the case and admits he doesn't want to collect the money. That's not even his goal. He wants to shut down InfoWars. They said this explicitly in both cases, in either opening statements or closing arguments. They said, your job here, they define justice as never letting Alex Jones on the air again. Never letting anybody like him also on the air again was what their goal. And they're not offended because of his position really on gun rights or on a whole bunch of cultural issues. They're offended because there's a whole bunch of other conservatives you could target for that. They're offended because he's the biggest deep state critic in America, frankly, in the media, period, and has been for a quarter century. The guy that's questioning the CIA, the FBI, the Justice Department, police abuse, championing Julian Assange, championing Ed Snowden, critical of Trump on things like vaccine mandates, held a 24-hour session attacking Trump when he went into Syria. And called it a betrayal and everything else. That's why they hate Alex Jones. Not because of his gun beliefs, not because of his Sandy Hook beliefs. And it's important to note, over 90% of the people connected to Sandy Hook never sued Alex Jones, never blamed Alex Jones. It was a tiny little portion that you dig deeper and you find they're political. What was the one thing Norm Pattis, longtime lefty civil rights lawyer who's defending Alex Jones in Connecticut, was not allowed to talk about at the trial? He wasn't even allowed to say the name Hillary Clinton. Why? Because Hillary Clinton led the legal onslaught against Alex Jones back in the summer of 2016. Basically called out, for him to be legally attacked, and that's when he suddenly was. Hillary Clinton was behind this. These are Hillary Clinton fans bringing this case. Not because that they really blame Alex Jones for almost any of this, because, by the way, they never sent, none of these plaintiffs, to my knowledge, ever even sent a correction request, a retraction request. That was a sign these people were not really upset about Jones. They were really upset about his politics attacking deep state priorities. And Hillary Clinton said, go after him. And so they did. And the plaintiff's lawyer comes out after the case and says, hey, Alex Jones audience, stop giving him money. That they made it clear. That was his whole point. I was like, now, when did you heard a plaintiff's lawyer saying, please don't send me a check? I mean, they call them ambulance chasers for a reason. Of course, a good plaintiff's lawyer gets there before the ambulance does. But that's another story. You have this dynamic where the plaintiff's lawyer is publicly saying, please demonetize Alex Jones. Please don't support InfoWars. Please don't buy any products from there. Please don't. And that just made it clear. This was all about shaming the audience, because what's the other unique thing about Jones, aside from his high-profile criticism of deep state, is kind of like the Duran and other models currently. He's the longest version of, hey, how can you build a media commentary network without any corporate support? How can you do so knowing corporations won't want to back you, won't want to advertise on you? How do you do that? You build an audience-based network. You build a network, you find products the audience wants that they like that will make their life better in other ways that you yourself use, and that's the means, but that's the secondary means, but the primary means is, hey, if you like what I'm doing, you keep me alive and afloat. And we won't have any corporate donors. We won't have any sugar daddy secret billionaires backing us. They are terrified at that model because that model completely obliterates the corporate controlled press that is so dominant in the West and the United States, especially. I mean, in Europe, you can have the government really intervene a lot more than other places. But in the United States, on paper, you can't. They rely on corporate control. It's a reason why, Fox, other than Tucker Carlson, you have so much warmongering and so much pro-vaccine talk. Well, just watch the ads. It's big pharma, big pharma, big pharma, etc. It's people who profit from the deep state or public health apparatus. And so that's why they want to crush Jones. And sadly, many of my friends on the right have been quiet about it because they're scared to talk about Sandy Hook. They're scared to defend Alex Jones in the court of public opinion. Jones's supporters are the working class, not the professional class, not the proper types. And as great Jerry Spence once said, the gentlemen of the bar often only care about the gentlemen of the bar. And he meant that in the old populist criticism way. So, yeah, it's a terrifying case for what it means for freedom of speech and freedom of press in America.
Does the Justice Department have a right to become involved in a case like this, one with constitutional issues? Because this brings me back to Merrick Garland, because given that this is an attack on free speech, which is defended by the Constitution, should not the Justice Department be stepping in and, bringing judicial reviews, asking the higher courts to look at this decision? I mean, I know this kind of thing does happen in some European countries. Does it happen in the United States?
So the way in which the U.S. Justice Department can have a role is that Alex Jones's company is filed for bankruptcy protection.
Yeah.
And so in that capacity, the U.S. trustee and the bankruptcy trustee come from the Biden Justice Department. This is where the story takes a turn, of course. Rather than trying to defend free speech or even do what they're supposed to do under bankruptcy laws. So bankruptcy laws are, we got to make sure this business can meet as many of its obligations as possible. That means that the bankruptcy court has a legal obligation to make sure InfoWars survives, to make sure InfoWars succeeds. However, the Biden administration people involved in Alex Jones's InfoWars Free Speech Systems bankruptcy have often been caught taking the opposite path, trying to prevent them from having bankruptcy protection, trying to preclude their ability to continue to operate, because that's how the Biden administration is willing to weaponize everything. There's nothing they won't weaponize politically within the legal process, even to the degree of a bankruptcy process to derail it from its proper role. What they should be doing is affirming free speech and raising this as a concern in the bankruptcy context and all the legal right, because what they should be doing is saying this debt they don't owe. And they don't owe this debt because it violates the Constitution that it was ever imposed. But they're not. Instead, they're going opposite direction and trying to undermine InfoWars. And so we're seeing the whole system exposed at every single level in the Alex Jones cases. The corruption of the American civil justice process, the attacks on free speech, the political weaponization of the system, finding technical means to get around core constitutional liberties and rights. At every single level. His potential remedy is with the Connecticut Court of Appeals or Connecticut Supreme Court. They have shown open, overt political bias in this case, so very unlikely he gets relief. Texas Court of Appeals in Austin, also very open and overt in their political bias, very tough to get relief. So his only real chance is that the Texas Supreme Court takes up the Texas cases where there's a 7-0 Republican majority, where two of the justices wanted to take this case up early because they didn't like where it was going. The U.S. Supreme Court, that's a long, long shot, but it's $1 billion verdict. The only other time the U.S. Supreme Court has taken up these kind of cases is the Westboro Baptist case, New York Times versus Sullivan. Last time it happened in America. In the 1950s, early 1960s, Southern courts weaponized their legal system to go after civil rights people on any grounds they could find. tried to get sneak peeks into people's private affiliation files. That led to NAACP versus Patterson, right to keep certain anonymous information about donors. Then they went after the New York Times and the civil rights organizations. That's what New York Times versus Sullivan was. Crazy verdict for the time, $5 million. And one of the things the U.S. Supreme Court said in that case was the constitutional requirement of colloquium. In order to be outside of free speech protection, you have to not only say something with actual malice about a public official or a public individual, but you also have to actually refer to them by name or comparable means. So like you stick up their photo and say this person, or it's such a small group of people that everybody knows who you're talking about. Like if somebody defamed the Duran, right? Assuming they couldn't confuse it with Duran, people are going to, okay, that's one of two people. So both of them can sue. You can reasonably infer that it was about you. But if, let's say, they said that the Duran locals community is A, B, C, and D, that would be much tougher because that's thousands and thousands of people. So the courts have always said you can't sue when it gets past a limited group of people, but they made an exception in Alex Jones's case. So that constitutional requirement of colloquium is his best First Amendment argument. He's got a lot. He's got every other argument. The big hurdle is the politics. All these courts are prejudiced against Alex Jones.
Yeah. Can I just say, I think this is the most important human rights case in possibly the world, alongside that of Julian Assange. I would put them at about the same level. I have to say, I find this case absolutely horrifying. And as I said, I was reading again in The Guardian, openly supporting the award against Alex Jones just the other day. And I have to say, well, whatever you think of Alex Jones, whatever your concerns about reporting, when somebody's ordered to pay $1 billion for things they've said, this is very, very bad. A country where things like this have happen is in a very bad place. And that's not the United States I used to know. I mean, that would have been inconceivable. Once upon a time, the ACLU would have been all over this case. And of course, it tells you more about the United States that they're not. Anyway, let's take on more things, because of course, you think that there's now a very, very good chance of the Republicans winning control of of Congress at the midterms. I would like you, Robert, just to, I think, as far as I'm concerned, squash a particular question that I constantly get badgering me on the live stream, on various live streams. Lots of people tell me that the midterms are going to be cancelled. I think that's unconstitutional. Am I right about that? I don't think that's going to happen. I don't think that's possible. I think it is legally impossible. I don't think that it's politically possible either. But just if you could just touch on that, because as I said, I've been asked about this so many times. I just want clarity.
And I understand people's concerns and skepticism about how things have gone with the lockdowns and everything else. But yeah, there's no constitutional means by which the president can suspend elections. America's elections are still conducted at the state level. In fact, the state government pretty much has carte blanche control. The federal government has extremely limited roles, and even that limited role is being stripped back from them by the U.S. Supreme Court. So they can make sure that you don't discriminate based on population size of a community in terms of redistricting. They can make sure you don't discriminate based on race or gender or religion under the 14th Amendment, and it's implementing legislation of the Voting Rights Act. But even that's going to be curtailed this term by the U.S. Supreme Court in the Alabama case, what that actually means and entails. So, but that's about it. Their power is very limited otherwise. They brought some suits in some cases to challenge some state election law reforms. They generally lost those suits. So it's going to be in each of the states, up to each of the states. Now, if for people worried about election fornication in a 2020 style, there's much less risk of that this term for three reasons. First, states like Arizona and Georgia passed laws that changed those rules to not allow them to happen again, and the courts affirmed and upheld those changes. Second, people are much more alert and awoke than they were before. You have people, in fact, you have articles in newspapers complaining about all the people flooding in to watch the elections, to participate as poll watchers, to participate at the local precinct, to see how things are done in such a way that it will be much more difficult to pull off some of the things they pulled off before. And third, the mass mail-in balloting campaign, which was the main source of controversy, has either been restricted by legislative reform or simply not been gone through at an executive level like it did before. Give an example in Wisconsin. The Wisconsin Supreme Court ruled that that method of mass mail-in voting by people who really weren't qualified to do it was constitutionally illicit, which meant the 2020 election. By implication, you couldn't read into that. But it means it's not going to happen in 2022. So there will still be some shenanigans. States that will be more problematic will be states like Michigan and Pennsylvania. Still the Democratic states, California, Illinois, and New York every other country in the world can report an election within the same night. Somehow California takes 6 weeks. Does anyone buy that? It's unbelievable. Sad. Brazil had the first round elections done within like 3 hours. They count Brazil. It's Brazil. They made a movie called Brazil about chaos, right? Brazil can do it, but America can't do it. It shows what we're up to, sadly. But there's not enough states for that to make enough difference in the House, in the Senate, in the gubernatorial races, in the state legislature races, in my opinion. I may be wrong, but we'll see. But definitely they can't shut down the elections. The elections will happen. They've already started because we now already have early voting that starts 3 weeks out, 4 weeks out, 5 weeks out, depending on the jurisdiction. I think a lot of that will get reformed in time. The Democratic Congress tried to pass election reforms to give federal control over congressional elections, but that failed. Now, the Biden administration has given a bunch of money to the U.S. Postal Office, clearly intending to inflate mail-in voting patterns, but their ability to implement that was always sharply limited. So at this point, it does not look like what we saw in 2020 will repeat in 2022, at least not on that scale. Will probably be more, a little bit in Pennsylvania where they're trying to put undated mail-in ballots and that get in, after election day and count them. There'll be a little bit of that, but not at anywhere near the same scale. And that's where I think Democrats are in big trouble. And I think what helped Republicans is that Democrats sold themselves a story in the summer, convinced themselves even through September that they were going to maybe could still hold the House, or if they didn't, it'd be a very small Republican majority that they could manage, and that they would hold the Senate so that they could kill anything in the Senate, that they would hold these key governorships that would set them up for 2024. And because they did that, I think they did not resort to the extreme actions of 2020, which they needed the pandemic to justify, nor some of the global disastrous policies that could have led to, global thermonuclear war, as people like the former ambassador to Russia, Michael McFaul, was talking about, as maybe that could work and be successful. It tells you the insanity of these people. And in response, I made fun of McFaul, saying, look, this guy was actually ambassador. Maybe this explains why Russians don't really trust us these days. And a CIA spook responded to me on Twitter, told me to stop. And it was, this is like he's one of those blue checkmark crowd. And it says, right, first job, CIA. And it's like, you got to be kidding me. I was like, you guys used to at least do this under subterfuge. Was that supposed to be intimidating? I was like, come on, just F off. See you later, pal. Go back to Langley. But it shows you kind of the mindset mentality of a lot of these people. And so I think that they took things for granted in ways that fortunately mean there'll be less risk of either a really disastrous October surprise or election fornication on election day. And Republicans are in excellent shape to have a massive victory that will shock the Democratic establishment badly. And then they'll figure out what they do. You have my view is I'm still recommending a bet on Biden being impeached before June 30th, 2023, because Republicans are under massive pressure to deliver. They'll not want to deliver on substantive policy. Their leadership will not want to deliver on substantive policy reform, whether it's Jim Jordan holding up big tech reform on antitrust issues, whether it's Kevin McCarthy holding up issues on Ukraine or other areas. So they almost have to go after Biden, go after Garland, go after the Secretary of HHS, go after some of these officials, because to establish the political theater they need. But either way, the deep state will have one of its bigger setbacks in modern ages come November 8th.
That's important. That's extremely important. Can I just say, is anybody saying, because we've just had a question, I saw a question about the situation in Britain. Is anybody in the United States making the point that Biden, who criticized the Truss-Kwarteng government's economic policies, that the Truss-Kwarteng's economic policies, the ones that have been trashed, the ones that the markets rejected, the ones that caused Kwarteng to resign, or rather be dismissed, and the ones which will shortly cause Truss to lose a job, that they're essentially the same as Biden's own policies? I mean, has anybody made that connection in the United States?
In the U.S., they've heavily hyped the tax aspect and ignored the inflationary spending aspect. And so that's where the tax aspect was kind of smaller as far as I could tell. The problematic aspect, I mean, they're all in denial here. That the massive spending that we went on in 2020, which led to, unlike quantitative easing, which was mostly holding up banks' balance sheets, the money we spent in 2020 went right into people's pockets. A lot of quantitative easing didn't, and that's why inflation didn't result. That the actual bank deposits of ordinary consumers didn't go up dramatically. There wasn't widespread circulation of money in the economy. There weren't a bunch of stimulation stimmy checks, sent out to Joe Blow so they could stick it in Robinhood and pretend to be a trader, not knowing Robinhood was front running their information for hedge funds, which is part of a separate class action here in America. So I think that there's been still denial of the U.S. and denial of the Ukrainian impact. I mean, they occasionally try to say Russia's war caused inflation. But it's like, come on. Russia didn't stop its oil spigots from Europe. Russia didn't sanction itself. I mean, we pretended they blew up itself and they attacked themselves and all those kind of nonsense things. But, most of those things we have to go away. I mean, when the Germans come out and say, we know who did it, but we can't tell you. Everybody knows who they're saying did it. It's like, I wonder who that could be. Oh, yeah. Red, white, blue flag, maybe. Our so-called ally that blew up our own pipeline. Merry Christmas from the Biden administration. So when he's not busy, sniffing girls' hairs again and harassing little girls again. What an embarrassing. This guy makes Boris Yeltsin at the end of his tenure look like a champion of public representation of a nation. And I mean, Boris Yeltsin, even Conan O'Brien had him, singing songs like La 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 Liquor towards the end of his, with his mouth reading stuff they used to do. And now Biden, grabbing behind a young girl, and you could see the girl's face. She's disgusted and wants to extract herself right away. President of the United States, old Uncle Joe, creepy Uncle Joe, unbelievable. But it shows where the mindset and mentality is with a lot of these folks.
Absolutely. Gosh, coming back to the Democrats, what do you make of the Tulsi Gabbard thing? This is something else we get lots of questions about. I mean, I'm not sure how important she is in American politics anymore, whether she's important at all. But, lots of people ask me, and whether this is a sign that, the Democrats are crumbling. And of course, there was this extraordinary episode with AOC finding herself criticized and, in a hall by people who were, wondering why she's voting to support Ukraine. But what do you make of the Tulsi Gabbard business? Is it the sign that she's leaving politics entirely? Is she positioning herself as an independent? Is it going to make any difference?
I think it shows the decay of the anti-war populist Democratic left. Yeah. That there's no place in the Democratic Party for someone like Tulsi Gabbard. No. So people got confused. People still get confused because the World Economic Forum took credit for Tulsi Gabbard early in her career when she wasn't a supporter of the World Economic Forum ever. And she's explaining no, they just stuck my photo on their website. It's like people who tell me that Nelson Mandela was definitely a communist because the Communist Party took credit for him after his death. If you're the Communist Party, wouldn't you take credit for Nelson Mandela? I mean, maybe he was, maybe he wasn't, but I mean, can you really trust that representation? So lots of people are going to take credit. I mean, Communist Party, we'll take credit for Thomas Paine, take credit for George Washington. They go, why not? Let's take credit for popular heroes, regardless of whether they really necessarily affiliate or align or not. So you look at Gabbard, her career, she was the number 3 in the Democratic Party in 2016 within the Democratic National Committee. She gave that up in support of Bernie Sanders. You look at the broader history of Tulsi Gabbard. Her father, she used to be socially conservative, comes from a distinct religious group that has distinct religious beliefs that are more socially and morally conservative on issues of abortion, on issues of gay rights, on issues of guns, etc. But that was before her personal political career for the most part. She goes into the military, serves, and she's kind of like your ideal photogenic one, she's photogenic already. Secondly, she has a military background. She's a military surfer girl. And that's like perfect combination from a political marketing perspective. She goes in, it's in her interest in Hawaii, given how liberal the state is, to be liberal on the environment, liberal on gun control, liberal on abortion, liberal on gay rights. So she reverses her family's traditional position on all of those issues. Gets elected to Congress, and it's quite clear she only really cares to get I think there was a part of her that was politically ambitious, but a stronger part of her that wanted to make a difference for her fellow soldier. And she very early on establishes anti-deep state creds, makes supportive statements about Edward Snowden, supportive statements about Julian Assange, famously goes to Syria to see if there's a way to both to investigate what's going on and see if there's a way to get peace, for which she gets ripped and attacked. People like Barry Weiss goes on Joe Rogan and attacks her. Hillary Clinton calls her a Russian agent, so on and so forth. And because he steps down from the Democratic National Committee because she sees corruption at the Democratic National Committee by Hillary Clinton against Bernie Sanders, then was considered by the Trump administration for a position at the recommendation of Steve Bannon, famously interviewed between the election and the inauguration in 2016 up in Trump's golf course in New Jersey. Might have been Connecticut, but I think New Jersey. And while she's in Congress, tries to maintain some sort of, it's like, okay, how do I advance anti-deep state populist positions and be like a loyal Democrat? And it becomes increasingly clear to her that it's not a manageable thing. So she runs for the presidential nomination on the Democratic side in 2020, has some support from the hardcore anti-war populist left Democratic base, but that can't get her past single digits in the current Democratic primary process. Retires from Congress. And I think she had determined already to shift more to the court of public opinion. Some people are thinking this is some brilliant politically manipulative move. I followed her career for a long time. I don't see that. I think this is someone whose primary drive in public office was policy, was cause, was principle. And there was a part of her that was naturally political, like her father. But I think she's slowly but steadily given up on that. And sees, I want to be a voice in the court of public opinion to try to resurrect this Democratic populist base. I think what you'll start to see is her shift on a range of other topics. You might see her moderator position on guns, for example, moderator positions on some other topics that I don't think were ever, core to who she is. You see that in the first she makes this, I have to leave the Democratic Party because it's become a warmongering party of elites that doesn't care about ordinary American values and doesn't respect freedom of speech, freedom of association, religion. She's been a very good spokesperson on issues of wokeism in the political and in the gender space, been a very good spokesperson against big tech censorship, as well as been a harsh deep state critic. So some of my conservative friends really despise her because of her other positions on other issues. That's their entitlement. Though some people were trying to imagine some super duper secret conspiracy for her to sucker populist people on the right to really, it's like, no, that's that. If you've looked at her whole career, that makes no sense. That's someone that's too obsessed with political partisan issues to see the broader picture here. And you're right. The real political significance of this was to start to wake up some of the populist anti-war left and going to, like, AOC wants to pretend she's this outspoken progressive spokesperson. And what the critics at her town hall, right after what Tulsi Gabbard did, was elevate the issue within the Democratic populist anti-war left, was what are you doing back giving billions of dollars to cause potential nuclear war in Ukraine, AOC? And AOC's only answer was, oh, I'm waiting for the deaf person to speak. Okay. I mean, she's clearly a narcissistic Instagram congresswoman that's a total fake. There's nothing about, she's been a deep state propagandist from day one. Well, I mean, when has she promoted Julian Assange? When has she promoted Edward Snowden? When has she attacked the Ukrainian war? It is sad, as Glenn Greenwald has pointed out, that not one Democrat has joined. It's been all Republicans in the House, which I think has shocked some people in the anti-war left who are still coming to terms with the cognitive dissonance that their biggest champion on questioning Ukraine are named Thomas Massey or Marjorie Taylor Greene. They're expecting it to be some great activist on the left, but there are none right now in the House. There are none in the Senate. There are very few across the country, period. And I mean, just a decade ago or so, Democratic Party was rife with elected officials challenging dumb and stupid foreign wars. They're now mostly gone. The deep state has had its greatest coup. And if you go to some of these neoliberals on the social media, you'll find them, woohoo, you know, we're championing empire openly. Look at how we're whooping up on China. Look at how we're whooping up on Russia. You know, Trump talked big, but we're big. And it's like, where do you people come from? Aside from these being what Kevin Phillips would call PT boaters, people who are all big when they're sitting in a boat, not in the middle of a conflict. It shows, Tulsi Gabbard shows the complete decay and decline of the anti-war left amongst Democratic elected officials. And the only question is, where do those people go? Right now, their only choice is people like Joe Kent, which is why Tulsi Gabbard's first endorsement was Joe Kent.
Yeah. It's the same in Europe, perhaps even more so. I mean, the Labour Party, which had a massive anti-war wing, vanished, disappeared, gone. Germany as well. You only have to look at the Green Party. I remember the Greens going out protesting about the deployment of US nuclear weapons in Germany. They were the anti-war party in Germany, and look at them now. So, I mean, what's happened to the Democrats in the US happened in Europe even more. In fact, it's extraordinary. And there's definitely a tale to be told there. There's definitely things that have happened which we just don't completely understand because we don't know the whole story. But someday we will find out. I think at this point it's probably appropriate for me to stop. And perhaps, Alex, you've got some points you wanted to make to Robert. Yeah.
Two questions for Robert that came in. Are you concerned, Robert, about Mark Elias during the midterms?
Oh, yes.
That he may
the
bring
dear Mark
suit to,
Elias, scumbag,
Elias
scuzzbag. Describe him.
Does that concern you?
Want. He's the biggest. He's the Democrat. For those people who don't know, he's the Democratic Party hatchet man, a key lawyer for unsettling elections. It is disturbing here. They're incorporating the old 14th Amendment provision. A state court in Alaska did this recently. So after the Civil War, past the 14th Amendment, we wanted to make sure that former Confederate generals weren't now taking over the United States federal government. That was basically it. So we're like, okay, if you served in the Confederacy, you don't get to get elected to office. Now, we later gave amnesty to everybody that removed that. We gave them two different amnesties, one in the 1870s, again in the 1890s. So it was considered to be dead. Then it got resurrected by, you're asking about one of the worst ever attorney general, the only one competing with Merrick Garland, other than maybe Bill Barr these days, is, of course, Mitchell Palmer. For his famous Palmer raids, locked up Eugene V. Debs for giving a speech against one of the most popular candidates in the country for the presidency at the time, millions of votes, for speaking out against World War I. Also deported a bunch of people that didn't deserve to be deported, that were in fact mislabeled, and some famous people amongst that list. And then, of course, famously empowered one J. Edgar Hoover to start the Federal Bureau of Investigation as independent agency. Going back to that time frame. So. But you look at what Elias has tried to do. He's tried to co-opt the political system. Currently, you have courts saying that the 14th Amendment disqualifies sitting senators, sitting state senators, sitting state representatives, sitting members of election boards solely on the grounds of they're supporting questioning the 2020 election. That's how insane it is. Or they're members of a group like Oath Keepers, which is a group dedicated to upholding the Constitution of the United States. So an Alaskan court is trying to do that currently. And so there are some signs, but I think Elias has a lot less power and influence this time than he did last time.
All right. Robert, are you concerned about the U.S. agencies, the CIA, FBI, etc.? You've done many videos about these agencies going rogue. Do you think they're still rogue, or do you believe they're now aligned with the present administration?
Mostly rogue, but what they're dominated more by neoliberals than neoconservatives, but that's a marginal difference. In other words, that means they self-justify their acts as wokeism. As Gary Wills pointed out long ago, Democrats are much better at waging war than Republicans because at least occasionally a Republican will admit that they're just there for the oil, whatever else. That's why I always love Trump. Well, we're go there. We got to take their oil. Got to take their oil. It's like so obvious. It's like you can criticize him for it, but at least he's honest about it. Whereas, Democrats are always fighting for the 4 freedoms or the 3 this or the American pie this or whatever. Or women and children and refugees and immigrants. Somehow that's why we have to fight wars. It's unbelievable. So a lot of them are dominated by that at the political hierarchical class. So that's the great risk, is that they're ideologically aligned with this administration. They think like Blinken does. Blinken, by the way, famous graduate of a certain Dalton school that was connected to Jeffrey Epstein, but that's another story for another day. But yeah, these are dangerous agencies. I still have a bunch of cases against a bunch of them, about to sue the Federal Reserve for withholding information on the Freedom of Information Act about the illicit activities they've been up to, suing the FDA concerning the vaccine in multiple contexts, including trying to force it on young children with false advertising, suing the U.S. Department of Agriculture in the Amos Miller case that I'm about to hop on a court call for. Attempts by big government to control what you eat and what you put into your body, and that you don't get to control that. They do. Going up against a major hotel chain that's targeting a person for political purposes, a major U.S. bank that's trying to debank a person for politically motivated purposes. Political weaponization is happening everywhere, and we have to fight back against it in every forum, including the court of public opinion.
Do you have time for a couple more questions, Robert?
I can do one more.
Okay, you can do one more. What's going on what do you think's behind the talk about nuclear war and Russia using nuclear weapons? What do you think's the angle there?
Justification for Ukraine or the U.S. to use it. Like if there's talk of a dirty bomb being smuggled into Ukraine or being developed in Ukraine, and it's a confession through projection. If we keep applying that filter, you'll see what the West is up to. And when it comes to Ukraine, 9 times out of 10, it tells you everything they're up to. And you see it with Michael McFaul. You see it, I think it was in a Guardian piece or another piece, where they're trying to justify limited nuclear war. That's the goal. And the pretext will be Russia was just about to do it. Russia was going to do it. It's like Curtis bombs away LeMay. What good are your nuclear weapons if we don't use them? I mean, that was a sad mindset. It's Dr. Strangelove time in some parts of the Capitol.
Wow. All right. We will end it there, everybody. Thank you very much to the great Robert Barnes. Robert, once again, where can people find you? I will have the link in the description box and pinned in the comments as well. But where can people find you?
They can find all the content at vivabarneslaw.locals.com.
All right. And Robert has to go. Alexander, let's wrap this up. Thank you to everyone that watched us on this live stream. Thank you to our moderators. Take care, everybody.